welcome to the Allison Supply Chains podcast. This is the February 2025 episode covering the latest news concerning third-party security, cyber risk management, and digital supply chain risk. Each month, we find the 6 most interesting stories happening and discuss them. If you like what you hear or prefer to read over listening, you can also find these stories in print form. You can join over 13,000 other readers by subscribing to the Allison Supply Chains newsletter over on LinkedIn today. All right, let's get this show started. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, Principal Researcher of the Defenders Initiative, and joining me is my friend Alexandre Sieira, the CTO and co-founder of Tenchi Security. How you doing, Alex?
Fine, I'm fine. How about yourself? Surviving a wonderful heat wave here in the greater São Paulo area, and I'm thinking a lot of cold people in the Northern Hemisphere are slightly envious right now.
Yeah, so here we have our first winter and then we have our second winter. So we have 2 springs, so we had our first spring where all the plants think that it's going to get warm and flowers start blooming. And then it goes right back down into freezing temperatures again and kills everything off. So we're right in the middle of that cold bit. But fortunately this week I'll be in Orlando, Florida for most of the week. So I'll miss almost all of the freeze.
Orlando, if I recall correctly, is the northernmost city in Latin America, right? So
well put.
They're gonna be enjoying Latin American weather, I guess.
Yeah, we'll see. Orlando can get cold also. All right, so for the vibes this month, we've got some strong vibes of regret from a French supermarket CEO that had to quickly retract some statements after one of his biggest buyers threatened a boycott. Tell us about this one.
So we were talking about this in the context of the fact that third-party cyber risk management is often related to you negotiating with your vendors, and we feel like this story is super interesting. So the global CEO of Carrefour, which is a global supermarket chain headquartered in Paris, made a comment at an event where he was playing a political angle towards the domestic audience of France, which is his largest market. And the European Union was about to close a trade deal with Latin America, and that included the fact that a lot of agricultural products from countries like Brazil, like meat from Brazil and Argentina, were going to be sold more cheaply to France. The French farmers, understandably, were not very happy about that. And so he made some comments around how that was a problem and that, Brazilian meat had quality issues, etc. And then remember when we talked on the last edition, I need to game theory those things and think about the next steps. The second largest market for Carrefour globally, not a lot smaller than the French market, is the Brazilian market, where they own a lot of supermarkets. And so those so the companies that sold meat to those supermarkets decided, our product is not good, so we're not selling to you anymore. Any consumers that want to buy meat in Brazilian supermarkets can go to whatever other supermarkets they like other than Carrefour, because you're not getting any meat anymore. And so this guy had to do like the quickest double take and turn around and say, no, what do you mean? I love the Brazilian product and the suppliers are great. We have a long-standing relationship, blah, 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 because he just jeopardized his revenue on his second largest market due to a flippant comment. So be careful. We need to be careful. And this is kind of the lesson for TPCRM folks. It's easy to pile onto vendors to try to do aggressive strongman tactics, especially when you feel like in your leveraged position and you're larger than the vendors. But these are long-term negotiations. Even if you can get a win on the short term, this might have other impacts for you on the long term, and have to think this through. Might apply to countries as well, but I'm not getting there.
Yeah, there's no way to just talk to French farmers, right? Or just to talk to one market. There's no way to talk behind someone's back without it getting out, right? Everybody has a mobile phone. Even if you're physically talking to a crowd, it'll get recorded. It'll get up on TikTok or Instagram. And they'll hear it, and something like this will happen. So it's
The thing we're trying always to tell our customers here is that we built here at Tenchi, we try to provide a cooperative way of doing third parties of risk management. So first parties and third parties working together towards the common goal of reducing risk, and try to minimize this sort of antagonism, which might look great in headlines, but doesn't bring a lot of results.
And speaking of transparency, we know a lot more about two stories that we talked about last month, sorry, in January. Beyond Trust's breach and the impact on that breach on the U.S. Treasury, because it was one of Beyond Trust customers here. So we now have some details. We now know that an internal report that Bloomberg received suggested that 419 systems were compromised, mostly employee laptops and desktops. And unsurprisingly, it looked like China was going after information on sanctions, and but no evidence of attempts to retain access long term or any kind of malware implants. So no persistence. I guess they got the information they wanted and they were done. So they moved on here. And Beyond Trust did report two vulnerabilities, and we weren't sure if these, if I recall, as you mentioned, there's no indication that these vulnerabilities had anything to do with the breach, and you were correct. They did not. But what did was one of Beyond Trust third parties had a vulnerability that was leveraged for the attackers to get in. So this was a fourth party scenario in this case where Beyond Trust got hacked through a third party and was other people's third parties.
So I actually have so we were right to be cautious about this, and so it's glad to see that we're not going to get everything right, but we got it this time. And I want to claim further victory here, because if you look at their description, they say a zero-day vulnerability of a third-party application was used to gain access to an online asset in a Beyond Trust AWS account. And when you say a third-party application, it could mean an application running on a fourth party, meaning one of Beyond Trust's third parties, but it could just mean they had software that was written by another company and they were running that software in their own AWS environment. The way they mentioned that a vulnerability in the software was used to obtain AWS account keys that belong to an account that Beyond Trust controls probably means it's the latter, right? They were running software on their own AWS environment, on a IaaS environment, infrastructure as a service environment. And that had a vulnerability, and that allowed people to extract credentials. And I mentioned the similarity, for example, to the Capital One breach, where people exploited the EC2 instance metadata service to obtain temporary credentials for AWS that had the same privileges that were assigned to that virtual machine. Again, this is seeming more and more plausible as I read this. Do I know for a fact that was what happened? No, but it seems plausible. And then they mentioned that access to that asset allowed the threat actor to obtain infrastructure API keys that could be leveraged against a separate AWS account that operated the infrastructure of that product that was compromised, remote support. So again, someone got in through another AWS account, found the vulnerability in a software there, obtained AWS account keys, and were able to jump across accounts to one where that service was running. So pretty interesting here. Their description, I mean, kudos to them for finding the attack. Kudos to them for being transparent. It's still not super clear exactly what happened. The third-party application thing is a little fuzzy, and it's kind of a theme today. But it seems like it's along the lines that we predicted.
Yeah, I mean, the way I'm taking, the way they got to laptops and desktops, I think Beyond Trust operates some kind of remote access, like you can connect into a desktop remotely and then control the desktop, something like that. So I assume that's what they mean when they say remote support infrastructure. They're talking about their product that would give access into customer systems, so like a team viewer or AnyDesk type of tool.
And they mentioned only the SaaS offering was compromised. So if the attacker got into the AWS infrastructure that controls the software running on the endpoints and allow the endpoints to be remote controlled, that's the path the attacker took. The other thing I would say is that the SaaS environment probably would allow the attacker to compromise many more of their customers. If they chose to only go after a specific few, by definition, it seems to have been a targeted attack, especially because we didn't see ransomware, we didn't see any extortion. It's just, I went into very specific sensitive systems in the Treasury Department and I'm getting information from there. and it's attributed to China. So again, seems like intelligence gathering operation.
Yeah, and by the way, thanks to Jake Blayberg and Jeremy Tarabay at Bloomberg for that story. We're going to try and mention the authors of the stories here. The next one I'm going to attempt to pronounce. So this is LinkedIn being accused of using private messages on LinkedIn to train an AI. João da Silva, is that how you say it?
João da Silva, that's that's a Portuguese. I don't know if it's from Portugal or from Brazil or from Angola, but João da Silva. Yes.
Yeah, and he writes for the BBC, and so this is a really interesting one because um, so all these companies are realizing that have all this data, and LinkedIn has very unique data. It is the only company I think in the world that has probably a majority of the world's workforce information. So if an AI wants to find out what my current role is, like it can find information out there. Like maybe I wrote a blog post once, and it said what company I'm working for, but that's no longer accurate. Years and years later, maybe I moved on to a different company. So only LinkedIn has up to date information on that. So they're sitting on a gold mine, and most companies have realized that they can get paid for giving access to this data that they're sitting on. Like Reddit, I think got a single payment of $60 million to give access to its data in one case. And now it is exclusive to Google search. If you want your search results to have Reddit in it, you can only go through Google. So I can see where the accusations come from, but from what I can tell, I don't know that we have any evidence that they've actually trained on this. This is all gleaned from the terms of service and the frequently asked questions and like the way things are worded changed. And generally people take that as an indication that something is going on behind the scenes here. And it's a sharp contrast. I remember when Salesforce came out with an ad campaign featuring Matthew McConaughey, just coming right out and saying, we're never going to train on your data. And I don't recall seeing too many companies do that. I think Salesforce was also somewhat unique in that respect. But LinkedIn is denying that they're doing this, but there is a class action lawsuit.
It's not just the changes in the privacy policy, it's that a setting popped up that was very well hidden under very, very nested navigation that you have to do, where you can opt out of sharing information for AI training. So it's not that you choose to opt in and they kind of do a campaign and try to convince you. You're already enrolled and allowing it unless you opt out. And then when people pointed that out, it's when they started changing retroactively, it's claimed, right? The privacy policy to say, oh no, but it wasn't our privacy policy. Well, the claim is that the option on the UI appeared before the changes on the policy. So they kind of did a dark pattern there is the point. Interestingly enough, they didn't do that on a few regions of the world. See if you figure out what they have in common that maybe the US doesn't have. The UK,
GDPR?
the European Union, Switzerland, you're a smart man. So on those locations, they didn't do it. What could possibly be the difference? Maybe a federal privacy legislation that is actually enforced. So,
Yeah.
so that's the thing that got people scared. And why are we talking about this here, right? LinkedIn is an enterprise vendor. Practically every HR department will use LinkedIn to look up candidates, to strike up conversations with candidates, to post open positions, either directly or through an intermediate system. And the thing that caught my attention here is that they claimed that they could access the content of DMs, of direct messages, to train AI as well. So you can imagine people saying, hey, but this is just public information, right? If you see the information that's on LinkedIn, like you chose to publish it. If you put your profile there, your work experience, okay, you should have the ability to consent or not, but it's public information. But the DMs are not. You can easily envision HR departments talking about sensitive things like how much you're going to get paid, maybe medical conditions, pre-existing medical conditions you're asking about, would it be covered on the company's health plan, or something, right? So you talk about your dependents, the rest of your family, would they be covered on the plan or not? And those would be even considered sensitive information under most privacy legislation, right? It's not just PII, it's like sensitive PII, which would be included on the DMs. So that's the thing that I found the most aggravating about this. I strongly encourage everyone to go and opt out. I did.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. All right, for our next story, we've got a couple, actually two things here. We've got a conduence breach, which impacted some payment systems for patients, and apparently they disperse $100 billion in U.S. government payments. I think this is a healthcare related company here with the mentions of patients, and it's just in 2025. I feel like we should know how to word a breach, how to handle a breach, and there's just many examples of how not to in the language here. It's very weaselly, like what I consider weasel language and defensive language, and like they're talking about how they did a good job with the investigation, and nothing to see here, nothing's wrong, move along, that kind of stuff that just doesn't age well, right? And certainly doesn't sound like they're taking responsibility or taking care of their customers in these patients. So yeah, that's the first half of story number 3, and there is a note that they were hit with ransomware in 2020, and this is not a small operation. They do 800 million in revenue per quarter. At least their last quarter was 800 million.
Yeah, apparently the services they provide impact over 100 million U.S. Residents, right? So that's interesting. And to your point about the description of the breach not being clear, again, the word third party gets thrown around a lot. So experience an operational disruption due to a third party compromise. I don't even understand what that means, because sometimes people say we were compromised by a third party, or we had a third party compromise, meaning like an unauthorized third party got access to our environment. So the third party could be the attacker. But sometimes is what we are thinking about here on the third party cyber risk management podcast, meaning I had a vendor or I had a sales channel or whatever it is, a partner. That third party was compromised and then they got to me through them. Which is it here? I have no idea.
It was an unauthorized pen test, right?
Right. So when you have ransomware, it's sometimes called an involuntary backup. So maybe that's what happened. But in this case here, we don't have a clue. But the fact that Conduent is a third party to the U.S. government for very critical services, for dispersing money and running critical programs that impact the U.S. population, is the angle here. And I want to say I'm going to be talking about this a lot. They don't have a security page, but I found a governance page on their website, and they proudly state that they are ISO 27001 certified. But they don't provide a link to the certification, right? Because the thing with SOC 2s and ISO 27001s, I think they're overvalued by the TPCRM community. And whatever small guarantee they might offer to how secure a company is, especially ISO 27001s, depending on how long you've had them, you're only audited once every 3 years, is what is the scope? I don't even know what the scope of the certification is. They don't tell us, and they don't have a link to the certificate where I could actually read what the scope was. Did they manage, their inventory process for hospital supplies? I don't know, for office supplies? It could be. We don't know what they certified in ISO 20001. What was the scope of the SOC 2 certification, right? So it might be completely orthogonal to the services they provide to the U.S. government, and people find unwarranted solace in the fact that someone has a certification. If you don't know what their statement of applicability was in the case of ISO 27001, or if you don't know what the scope was, I'd find zero solace, right? Let alone understand how shallow and how infrequent the checks are based on how quickly systems change, how quickly attackers evolve. Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Zanshin, the innovative SaaS solution for third-party cyber risk management that's disrupting the market with a cooperative, continuous, and comprehensive approach. Zanshin is the first product to allow first parties to gain true visibility into their third parties in a non intrusive way. Gain a deep understanding of how secure your third parties are in key areas like cloud security, endpoint security, identity and access management, and at risk encryption. Visit Tenshi at tenshisecurity.com to schedule a demo or free trial and see for yourself how enterprise customers are able to reduce third party risk by 80% or more in just a few weeks. Yeah, so thanks to Jonathan Grieg at The Record for that story. And the next one here is Joseph Cox at 44 Media, which is one of my favorite new media companies here. It's just four folks, mostly from Vice Motherboard, ex-Vice Motherboard folks, and just doing a killer job breaking stories and filing millions of FOIA requests for information from the government. And this one is about a company called Gravy Analytics, which is kind of a funny name given that they're a massive data broker. And yet they have sold masses of smartphone location data to the U.S. government. And this is usually when we see this, we think my brain defaults to, okay, we're talking about U.S. telecoms. But this is very global data. They've got data from everywhere from Mexico to North Korea to Russia and the U.S. And they've enhanced some of this data too. I found this interesting. They have tags like likely driving. You know, if you're looking at GPS data and that GPS dot starts jumping very quickly, you can determine the speed, and you know that somebody's likely driving, or maybe they're on an airplane or something like that. And yeah, really interesting data. So, you know, you can put together a map of a single, I assume a single smartphone, and track its movements with this kind of data.
And this is super dangerous. On the last podcast edition, we mentioned how that the U.S. telecoms were fined for selling this sort of location data, but it can be sourced from a variety of places. We've seen either legitimately or illegitimately SDKs that are used by mobile app developers. They have capabilities that collect that data and then phone home and send it to whoever wrote that SDK, right? For advertising reasons, you see that being used a lot, but of course not just for that. Law enforcement, intelligence agencies, all sorts of uses can be made of that information, and it can be like harmful to your physical security if that information leaks, right? People know where you live, where you go, the places you frequent. That's serious business. And to be true to the last conversation we had about this, in December, the FTC announced it had a settlement with Gravy and a second broker, Mobile Walla. Is it mandatory on that business to have weird names? I don't know. Did the US pass a law or something? After accusing them both of engaging in deceptive practices by gathering location data without proper consent, which is one of the things that privacy legislation explicitly requires. If you collect personal information about someone and their movements is clearly, you know, where they live, where they work, where they shop, clearly is personal information. It can put them in like physical danger. It would have required them to have consent. So I have no idea how much teeth the FTC here has on enforcing this without a federal privacy legislation in the US, right? But they did do a settlement, which is like a step in the right direction. They are or they have been until recently, who knows now what's going to happen, trying to enforce some sanity here, which is good news. And the question I would have for the third-party cyber risk management folks on listening to us right now is your company involved in either selling or buying this sort of information, PII or location data? And if so, do you have any liability related to this incident or others? You might feel comfortable that your company is headquartered in a country that doesn't have federal privacy legislation, that you overwhelmingly do business with citizens of countries that don't have privacy legislations that are being enforced. But are all of them? Because it might take just a couple of people going to your online store that are from the European Union, and now you might have some liability according to the GDPR, or maybe a few Brazilians, and you're going to have liability according to the LGBT, which is our privacy legislation, and so on and so forth. So I would double check if your company is any way related to this, even if you feel like those legislations don't apply to me, they might, right? Let's be very careful with this.
Yeah, and the FTC has systematically been hitting companies with fines for collecting too much customer data, but I don't know how that works when your entire business model is collecting data, right? Like, what's too much? So I want to move on to story number 4 here, and I just want to tackle the global regulations changes here. So the UK has a new bill taking effect in 2025, the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. DORA is now in effect, which the R in DORA also stands for resilience. And I think this is going to continue to be a trend here as ransomware campaigns take down businesses, more focus on business continuity, keeping the business rolling, recovering quickly. Israel has a new cybersecurity standard certification for banking supply chains, and I think DORA also just applies to financial institutions. And then finally, I think the most interesting of these is Thailand's requirement for banks, telecoms, and social media platforms to co-pay victims of online scams.
So let's start with that last one because it's super interesting. It's called reversing the burden of proof, right? So if you are suing someone to say I lost something, you have to prove that it's their fault in order to get reimbursement from them on like a civil lawsuit, right? But sometimes you have that in labor legislation or sometimes in consumer legislation in many countries where the burden of proof is reversed. If one of the sides on that lawsuit is much bigger, much more resourceful than the other one, especially again if it's a business against a consumer, the law might state that the burden of proof is reversed. So the business has to show that it did everything by the book. It's not the customer that has to prove that it was wronged. And that seems to be what Thailand is doing here. And I actually have personal experience with this because when online banking was starting in Brazil, that's pretty much the path that the courts took. The thinking was you are pushing your customers into online banking because it's a lot cheaper than maintaining staff and physical bank branches, right? So it is advantageous to you. So now if you're forcing or nudging your customers towards a less secure means of doing business with them, you have to be held responsible for this, right? And up to this day, the bar for a bank to show that it was actually the customer's fault, like they shared their password with someone or etc., like they didn't follow the guidance that the bank explicitly said for how they should use the online banking app. Because if in doubt, the courts will side with the customer in that case, right? And I think it's an interesting way. I'm not a lawyer, but it feels like it's an interesting way to align the economic incentives in a way in which the entity that has the most power to actually implement security controls is incentivized to do it. Because if the fault is always with the consumer can't change how secure the system of their vendor
Yeah.
are, like the bank or the online retailer or whatever it is, right? So I really feel that's one of the ways in which regulation or even the courts, just for jurisprudence, just for case law, can impact the change here. The final thing I want to say is that I found it really interesting about the Israeli legislation, where they're trying to implement baseline security model for their banking industry, which is a good thing. And then I got very disappointed when I read it's going to be implemented, and I want to quote, based on a unique questionnaire accompanied by inspections conducted by specially trained professionals. So, because we all know how much sending people questionnaires and doing the occasional audits helps prevent third-party breaches, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a start, but it's a very, very flaky start. It's an acknowledgement of the scale and gravity of the problem, but I think it falls very short of things that already are in place.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we got enough time to cover one more story briefly. This one is a new ransomware tactic coming from Halcyon, I think is how you say the name of that company. Their research team, which is called Rise, discovered this. And some research that we did, I think that you did, Sieira, found that this has actually been going on for some time, where there's a bring your own key feature in AWS, where if you break into somebody's AWS, you can then use your own encryption key to encrypt their stuff. And because only you have that key, now they need to come to you to get things decrypted. So you now have data hostage, and you have a classic ransomware situation, except you've done it in AWS using their own infrastructure against them.
It's the best of both worlds for the attackers. Zero cost, fast encryption, guaranteed decryption, and very little recourse for the for AWS or the AWS customer. And I want to give credit where credit is due. This is pretty much exactly one of the scenarios that's the late Spencer Gitson, very well-known security researcher in the cloud security community, which sadly passed away a couple of years ago. He presented it on DEF CON Cloud Village about 4 years ago. He might have written a paper before that, talking about exactly that scenario. So what the attackers here are doing is there's a feature on S3, the object storage infrastructure for AWS, where you can do exactly that. There's an API call where you instruct AWS saying, hey, I'm going to encrypt this file. And typically what you want to do when you do at rest encryption in AWS is use a key that is managed by the AWS key management service, because then the AWS also has the key and they go hand in hand and you have policies around that. But if you're really, really super paranoid, you might tell AWS, no, don't use a key that even you, AWS, have. I'm going to send you the key now. You encrypt the file with this key that I just provided as a parameter to the API call, and then you throw it away. You never store it anywhere. You, AWS, don't get to keep that key. You have to trust that AWS will do it, but I think it's a fair assumption that they won't, right? In normal business operations. So if you happen to be an attacker that finds a valid AWS API key for someone, and again, we just discussed one way in which they can do it, but there are countless other ways in which people can get valid credentials for your AWS account, and that API key happens to have read and write privileges to an S3 bucket, they can do this attack. They provide an encryption key that they control. They don't even pay the cost of downloading the data, encrypting it, and sending it over. AWS does all the work, charges the customer, charges the victim for actually encrypting the data. So it's good times for the attacker, nightmare scenario for the defender here. Not even AWS can recover the data. Only the attacker that has an encryption key can do it, unfortunately. So pretty smart attack. What this means is lock down your cloud environments. And that brings me again to the age-old question: how do you know how locked down your third parties' cloud environments are? Right. That's a big question. You're looking outside in. If you look at questionnaires, you're not getting an accurate and complete view of that.
Yeah, and I think this is a feature you can disable. The bring your own key if you're not using that feature. The reporting seemed to suggest that this is something you can disable. So
you can
that's probably something you want to do if you're not planning on using it.
You cannot give your users or your entities or roles access to that specific API call. Like there are ways to not allow that, but it's related to privilege management, like authorization, which operations you can perform or not, which is hard to do in a complex, large environment. Making sure you're doing list privilege, it's a challenge. It requires a lot of discipline, a lot of automation in large environments.
Yeah. Well, that's all we've got time for this month. Alexandre, thank you so much for joining me today. This is always a lot of fun.
Thank you. It was a genuine pleasure.
And if you liked what you heard and you're on a platform where you can like, subscribe, or leave a comment, please do so. We'd love to get your feedback. Stay safe and stay vigilant, and we'll see you again next month.